Hello, and welcome to Principles of Accessible Design. My name is Michael J. Young, and I'm an in-house designer for the Government of Ontario. I've been working in accessibility for 7 years, where I was mostly working on the designs of resources and tools to help organizations meet Ontario's accessibility laws. I helped partner organizations, other government ministries, and private sector design studios create attractive designs that are both AODA compliant and user friendly. I'm also a registered graphic designer, and I'm part of the RGD Accessibility Advisory Committee. Now, this is a re-recording of a webinar that I presented originally in July 2017. Over the next 45 minutes, I'll be covering the fundamentals of accessibility for print, web, and environmental design. As such, this presentation is especially helpful for students and designers preparing for RGD certification. So, what will we be covering? I'll be going over what is accessibility and what it means, accessibility laws in Canada, different types of communications, so whether those are printed, on the web, or environmental. And lastly, I'll wrap up where you can find resources to learn more about accessibility. So, what is accessible design? Is design accessible by nature? So, I would agree. I'd say that all design, by definition, promotes accessibility. And that as a profession, we are committed to providing easier access to our audiences. So, that said, why do we need accessible design? What does it mean to go beyond what we are already doing? Well, we really need to ask ourselves, what if our designs could be even more accessible? And if there's anyone that we are excluding when we are designing things. So I wanted to start off with a beautifully simple poster by Stephen McCarthy on the gov.uk digital services blog. The blog post is called Graphic Design for Government Services, and the function part of design is what I'll be focusing on today. So the poster above reads, "Don't ask, how should it look? Ask, what must it do?" So how can we create information that works for everyone, regardless of ability? Now the poster touches on two important aspects of design, form and function. But as designers, we have another skill, a secret weapon, if you will, that we apply to all of our projects and design problems. Do you know what it is? It's empathy. Being able to know our clients and to empathize with our audience and the people who will be using our design, and to create a solution that works for them. It's something that we do naturally, but if we focus on that empathy and we try to use that to the greatest degree possible, we can go a long way to making our designs more accessible. So what is accessibility? Well, in the government, we often use this definition, which I love. It's giving people of all abilities the opportunities to participate fully in everyday life. So yes, that refers to environments, so it's ramps and elevators, but it's also websites or our print design or posters or logos even. Why not? So accessibility is a matter of attitude, it's a matter of inclusion, and it's also understanding that people with disabilities may have different needs. As designers and communicators, most of what we do falls under the umbrella of inclusion. But if we don't have the other two aspects, attitude and an understanding of people with disabilities, we don't really have the tools necessary to achieve an inclusive design. So what are some different types of disabilities, and who are we designing for? Well, it would be impossible to cover everything, but some of the more typical barriers to information are vision, so either low vision or no vision, and yes, this includes color blindness, people who are deaf or hard of hearing, people who are unable to control a computer in a typical way or use special assistive technologies to control their devices or their smartphones or their tablets, people with learning disabilities, people who have language barriers, that's a big one, and other. There are endless amounts of different types of disabilities, and some of us who don't think that we have a disability may be disabled at times if we, for instance, forgot our glasses or are in a foreign country or something. So all of us can have barriers to information at times. So what are the accessibility laws in Canada? Well, so far, 3 provinces have accessibility legislation in place. Ontario, which enacted legislation in 2005, Manitoba in 2013, and Nova Scotia in 2017. British Columbia and the federal government are also expected to announce legislation before the end of the year. Ontario's legislation is the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, or AODA. Now, the AODA, while far from perfect, has the most developed legislation, with 5 standards, several of which are undergoing updates. So most of the references to legislation that I'll be speaking about deal with the AODA. So now that we know what accessibility is, what needs to be accessible? Design formats that are covered under the AODA are websites and web content, videos and audio clips, information and communications. Now sometimes print information, which by its nature is inflexible, can only be accessible upon request. So just bear in mind that that's something that you may need to have ready. Also, some signage is covered under the AODA. However, most signage is actually covered under the building code. It's important to consider accessibility early on in your process. If you think about accessibility when you're creating new information or new designs, it not only makes it easier when someone asks for it, it makes the information accessible for others to share and then to build upon. So when should we integrate accessibility into our design process, you might ask? Should it be in research, strategy, creation, execution, or evaluation? Well, the answer is yes, all of the above. It's important to have accessibility considered during all parts of the design process. So whether that's researching your users, conducting a strategy, definitely the creation and execution of the piece, although if you consider accessibility early on, often it won't become such a surprise during the execution piece. And to consider it during the evaluation stage, to ask, how did we do? How could we do better? Was there anyone that we excluded? Was there anyone that was included in this new accessible approach that we could also use in our other projects? So first we'll focus on print design. Under the AODA, there are no specific requirements for print design. So that includes no minimum font size, no specific typefaces or fonts that you need to use. There's no specific requirements. But that said, we need to ask ourselves, do our designs help or hinder accessibility? Print is an inflexible medium, so when we're designing for print, try to make it as accessible as possible from the get-go, but also we need to provide options. Is the document available online or digitally? And how can it be provided in an alternate format upon request? That's an important one because, at least under the AODA, if someone requests an accessible document, the organization needs to provide it to them. So next, I'll cover some of the tools that we have as designers for creating accessible print design. Grids and hierarchy. Now, grids and hierarchy ensure a consistent structure, and they provide consistency across the page, across sections, and entire books and documents. Unlike HTML, where we can semantically indicate the importance of a heading, in a printed piece, the visual hierarchy needs to be clear to indicate appropriate heading levels and navigation through a document. The printing surface. So the printing surface can make a big difference for people who may have low vision. Using a matte or uncoated stock rather than a glossy paper can make a big difference in making the text appear more clear and easier to read. Obviously, you can't always use a matte or uncoated paper, but when you can, and when you know that your audience is people who are older or may have trouble seeing, it's a good choice to make. The binding itself is another way to provide an option of making a printed piece more accessible. If you were to use, say, a spiral bound or a coil bound that would lay flat upon a table and make it really easy to turn pages and not have the document bouncing around on the table, it's much easier. So consider both the printing surface, but also the binding and all of the mechanics that go into a printed piece. Color and contrast. So designers need to be sensitive to the challenges of low vision and color blindness. Tonal or value contrast is generally more important than color contrast. It's also important to remember that color alone should not be used to indicate differences or choices. For example, highlighting text to show its importance. Instead, use descriptive text or symbols, or both. It's important in print to try to achieve at least a 70% tonal contrast. So the image that I have on the screen is an accessible color palette builder for creating accessible color combinations. Now, this particular tool is for web development, but it's handy for print design, and the link will be available at rgd-accessibledesign.com. So when you're creating a printed piece, you can always save a screenshot and maybe convert it to grayscale to check the contrast in Photoshop or something. And just remember that you want to achieve at least a 70% tonal contrast, just to make sure that everything is nice and provides enough contrast so people with low vision can see it properly. So one of the biggest things that we can change in a printed piece is the typography. So again, just as I was covering, here's a couple of things to consider when you're choosing how you're going to be using type. So the typeface style is arguably the most important, and there's a big difference between display type, such as those on screen, such as Rosewood or Ziggurat, and text type, such as Gotham. So be aware of how you're using it. If you're just using it in very short bursts, maybe for a logo or a title, something more ornate may be appropriate. But if you're using it for long body copy, then you'll definitely want to go with something plainer and more legible with open counters and a large X height if possible. So the shape and weight of the type. As I was saying, choose typefaces with a large X height and open apertures, so nice open spaces that don't have the space in the E, for instance, all closed up and small. For text typography, use weights that are not too heavy or too light, and avoid extreme weights and widths. So nothing extra condensed or, wide expanded for text typography anyways. And try to use larger fonts if necessary. It'll seem a little bit awkward at first, but you will get used to designing on a slightly larger scale, and it does make it easier for older adults or people with less than perfect vision. The size and scale of typography is important. So because we read the shape of the word, it's better to use mixed upper and lowercase. And if you're going to use uppercase or italics or extra bold or something, try to use it sparingly, especially for all uppercase. That can be very tiring to read if you are reading a whole paragraph set in all caps. You know how hard that can be, so try to just be aware, and if you know how your audience is going to be interacting and reading the piece, just consider the size and the scale of your type. So just another thing is that font sizes can vary quite a bit. So here's an example of two typefaces at the exact same size. Now obviously, Meta has a much larger X height, which is the height of the lowercase x, and true, the letters are larger, but due to the larger X height and the open spaces or counters within the letters, it's also much more readable. And this, obviously for a short word, it's more readable, but for an entire sentence or paragraph, that would just be compounded. So the spacing and the alignment and the leading or line height all need to be considered. Obviously, having a column width that is much too wide, such as both of these examples, provides text that's very hard to read. Your eye gets to the end of one line and it doesn't know where to begin when it gets back to the other side. In the second example, you have letter-spaced italic type that's center aligned, and I mean, this might look good if it's just a few words on a wedding invitation, but for a whole paragraph or a book, this would just be way too tiring to read, and people with low vision would definitely have trouble reading this. So a better way of doing that is just to try to use a leading or a line height of about 120 to about 150% the size of the typeface. For the column width, you want to stick to about 45 to 75 characters. That works out to about 20 to 40 times the size of the typeface. Another interesting way to remember that is to save a text file with the alphabet typed out. And since the alphabet has 26 letters, that would make it so that 2 to 3 times the alphabet is a good rule of thumb. And this is a little bit easier sometimes than going up to the info palette or doing a word count, just to plunk the alphabet down in there. So a question that I often get asked quite a bit is there a minimum type size for accessibility? Well, under the AODA, there is no minimum type size for printed documents. But, in general, aim to make your text larger, which makes it more comfortable to read and more accessible. If you know your audience is mostly over the age of 45, going with a printed type size of 10 to 12 points won't stand out as being particularly large, but it will be a welcome change for older adults or people with less than perfect vision. And when we get to our 40s, our eyesight begins to diminish, so that's where the age of 45 sort of comes down there. But yeah, just getting used to and using larger type sizes when you can is normally a good idea. People rarely complain that the type is too large. And it's also important to remember that when it comes to web design, which I'll be covering next, small type is hard to read on lower resolution screens and monitors. So going large rather than small also ensures a comfortable reading for users if a printed piece is read online or on screen. So turning to web design, web design is a little bit different because there are a lot more tangible benefits of digital accessibility. So digital accessibility directly and indirectly benefits the following: people with disabilities, of course, people using assistive technologies. So that might be anything from only using the keyboard to using a refreshable braille display to using a voiceover or software that like JAWS that speaks, so a screen reader that speaks to them. Search engines will you'll have better search engine optimization if you make your site accessible or your web content accessible. And it really just benefits all users because there may be times when we need to zoom into the text to read it, or to print something, or to search a document, and just having web content that's more accessible from the start will benefit everybody. So, I mean, digital accessibility or accessible web content is really about creating flexible content. It can be difficult to address the needs of your client, various platforms, browsers, and language barriers, let alone people with disabilities. So it's why we need to make flexible content that's not just, as Yuda Trevianis says, it's not just one size fits all, but it's one size fits one. So people are able to customize the web content in a way that suits them. They can change the size of their browser, they can zoom in, they can turn on accessibility features such as high contrast if they need to. And it just really creates a content that's more flexible and that everyone can make use of. So when you're talking about accessible web content, you don't get too far before running into WCAG, which is the Website Content Accessibility Guidelines. and it's an internationally accepted standard for web accessibility developed by the World Wide Web Consortium. So WCAG 2.0 was published in 2008 and has 3 levels of accessibility: A, AA, and AAA, and each builds on the last. Most jurisdictions that have laws about web accessibility use A and AA for their standards. AAA is mainly intended at providing accessible features to very specific disabilities. So it would be having, instead of having closed captions, it would be having open captions. Or instead of just providing a transcript of a video, it would be providing a ASL video, so someone doing sign language captured on video, so for people who are deaf, who may prefer that. So AAA is very good, but it's quite a bit harder to achieve than AA, so there's a big gap between those two. It's also interesting to note that WCAG 2.1 is currently in development and may be adopted by the W3C as early as mid-2018. So just some more about WCAG. WCAG sets out guidelines for organizations to make their websites more accessible. The guidelines cover things like writing using plain language, providing alternate text for images, and making sure someone can navigate the web using just a keyboard. So while WCAG 1 focused on techniques, to be compatible with future technologies, WCAG 2.0 focuses on 4 main principles of web accessibility, as well as presenting some techniques in separate documents. So by focusing more on principles rather than on specific techniques, version 2 of the guidelines is far more flexible and encourages developers to think about the process conceptually. The 4 main guiding principles of accessibility in WCAG 2.0 are perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. And you can also remember those by remembering the acronym POUR, so P-O-U-R. So just tell your clients and friends that you're making poor web design choices, and you can have that little inside joke. So here's a screenshot of the WCAG table of contents, and as you can see, there are many techniques under each guideline. So I'm going to cover, obviously I don't have time to cover all of these techniques, but I'll be covering a few things and just giving you sort of a very high-level overview of some of the things that you might need to think about. So for the perceivable principle, you need to create web content and interface components must be presented in ways that all users can perceive, even if they have impaired vision or hearing. So that means that users must be able to perceive the information being presented. It can't be invisible to all of their senses. So CAPTCHAs, for instance, those have specific guidelines about how those need to be accessible to people who have disabilities. So for example, if you're asked to enter the text in a picture and you're blind and using a screen reader, this example shows that you can also have text read in an audio file, and then you would just enter that. Time-based media needs to be accessible. So time-based media is anything, so that's video or audio, anything that has a running time, essentially. So captions are a very common technique under the time-based media. So as you can see in YouTube, there's functionality to, it'll auto-generate the captions for you, and then you can just go in and edit those captions and correct any mistakes. So that's probably the easiest way to create captions without learning any specialized software. You also need to create flexible content. So here's a screenshot of the accessibility page on the Government of Ontario website with all the styles turned off. So as you can see, the website still makes sense. The content is still there, and it's semantically correct with the headings indicated and the hyperlinks, but there's just no style for it. So this might be beneficial, and it's just a good way to review your site and just make sure everything flows in the right order, because if someone were to, say, use a screen reader, this would be the order in which it appears. And minimum contrast. So there are ratios in order to have specific levels of contrast for your colors. Obviously, this is quite a dramatic example shown with an alternate style sheet for the CNIB, the Canadian National Institute for the Blind. But there are many resources about coming up with accessible color palettes, and those will be able, I will make sure that those are on the RGD Accessible Design website. The second principle of WCAG 2.0 is operable. All users accessing a website, regardless of how they operate their computers, so by mouse, keyboard, voice recognition, switches, or any other input device, must be able to simply and accurately manipulate all interface and navigation components. So this means that users must be able to operate the interface, and that the interface cannot require interaction that a user cannot perform. So some of the guidelines under that section is that any sort of timing needs to be adjustable. So for instance, if you're registering for an event and you only have 15 minutes to buy tickets or something, you must either be able to extend that or at least be aware of that and view it. Any sort of animation or carousels need to be able to, you must be able to pause, stop, or hide them. Well, I don't think you need to hide carousels, but you need to be able to pause and stop and interact with them. For any sort of video, you might need to hide audio if it's auto playing. So that's all under section 2.2.2. Multiple ways. So there needs to be multiple ways of getting to a section on a website. So most of the time that can be as simple as having a sitemap. The screenshot here is of the RGD website, and it just shows a simple sitemap in the site's footer, which again, it benefits people who need that for accessibility reasons. It's also just handy, and it's a good way of navigating the site if you're used to it and you just want to know where everything is at a glance. So the third principle needs to be understandable. So create the clearest possible content and interfaces so that all people, including those with cognitive disabilities, understand our websites. So that's a little bit lofty that all people would understand our website, but it means that users must be able to understand the information as well as the operation of the user interface. So in other words, the content or operation cannot be beyond their understanding. So the content needs to be readable. In Guideline 3.1, I have a comic with a businessman walking into a lobby, and there's two desks. There's information, and then there's clarification. So he kind of has a bit of a confused look on his face, which is funny. And error identification is another guideline that you'll need to consider. So when you're filling out a form, for instance, you need to know if you've made any errors. So in this case, it highlights all of it in red, but just in case you're colorblind, it also has symbols and error text, and it indicates what field is wrong with another icon. So lots of different ways that it's describing exactly what you need to do and what went wrong. Lastly, robust. Content must be robust enough that it can be interpreted reliably by a wide variety of browsers and devices, including current and future assistive technologies. So that means that users must be able to access the content as technology advances. As technologies and user agents evolve, the content should remain accessible. So try to make it as future-friendly as possible. 4.1 is about it being robust and compatible. And there's a picture on screen of lots of different devices, laptops and tablets and phones and e-readers, and just a subset of all the things that we kind of need to design for these days. But just to remember to make it as compatible as possible, and try to make it, if you code your sites using web standards, there'll be a really good chance that it'll work 5, 10, 20 years down the road. So turning to environmental design. So just to let you know, I don't have a ton of experience with accessible environmental design myself, but I will try to pass on some of the key principles of environmental design for accessibility. So a large part of what that is creating accessible wayfinding. So what is that? Environmental design helps people orient themselves and navigate to their destination. Accessible wayfinding is about eliminating barriers and accommodating individual needs and preferences. It involves a series of decisions by which people moving through an environment can reach their desired destination. It's more than just signs. It's about using or creating architectural features and landmarks, about verbal instructions, printed materials, electronic displays, interactive technologies, and signage. There's a really neat example of interactive technologies happening right now in Toronto, where there's GPS beacons being installed in the Yonge and St. Clair neighborhood. So that allows people to use their phones, their smartphones, to navigate both outside in the neighborhood, but also within buildings, using special wayfinding apps on their phones. So people who are blind or may use a guide dog just have such a better and richer understanding of the neighborhood and where they are and how to get around. Environmental graphic design is about space planning and making use of architectural features to guide people. So provide different means of wayfinding for people with various types of vision loss, such as Braille for people who may be have been born blind or lost their sight at a very early age, but also using tactile signage for people who may have low vision or lost their sight later in life and never learned Braille. It's mainly about following conventions and regulations. For example, wall-mounted signs must always be on the latch side of the door and be installed at a set height. This creates a level of consistency for people who are navigating environments and may have disabilities. So just following these conventions and regulations makes everything all that much easier for them. It can also involve technology such as GPS beacons, as I spoke to just a minute ago. So there are different types of wayfinding. It's not all about signs. So there's spatial wayfinding, which tends to happen naturally as we orient ourselves to an environment, as we get used to the landmarks and just the environment that we are part of. But it can be much harder for infrequent visitors. So distinctive features definitely help orient people, and it's a way to make it easier for people to know where they're going. If you've ever been in a complicated mall or in for instance, the PATH system in Toronto, it's underground and all the stores tend to look the same, so it's easy for people to get lost in there. It's because there's no distinctive features that really help orient people. So linear wayfinding is another type of wayfinding, which guides people systematically rather than simply helping with orientation. Now this is a more common form of wayfinding, and it guides people by means of a map and or strategically placed signs. So at an airport or in a shopping mall, this is probably what you're used to. Now, linear wayfinding is good in that it builds trust, but the system itself needs to be complete and thorough, or people won't trust it or use it. So then it's sort of useless. So it really needs to be built in such a way that it's very thorough and complete, and people that can trust in it. So here's an example of spatial wayfinding at Toronto Pearson Airport. And it shows a large electronic display with the number 120. So if you're all across the hall, you can point that out to people. Also on the wall, there's some colorful painting just with large abstract color. So you could tell people, it's like, oh, you know, go over there by the 120. Oh yeah, it's by the yellow and pink section of the wall. And people would know where you're talking about. Linear wayfinding is also used in airports. So here's another example of how if you were looking for arrivals, you would just be following the arrows and the icons. Whether you're looking for luggage or for taxis and public transit. I believe the arrivals signage are all in green versus departures and connections being in different colors. So it's just a way of classifying information and making it easier for people as they move step by step throughout the process. And lastly, just to give you a glimpse of the kind of regulations and requirements for typography for accessible signage. So these are some examples of the structure or the nature of the letters that you have to use. So for example, the width of the letter O must be between 55 and 110% of the height of the uppercase I. And that the stroke width is 15% maximum of the height of the letter. So you can't, I mean, you have very specific fonts that you need to use, and that's for a reason. That's to be able to help people read it from a distance and be able to see where they're going. This can't be an area for expressive typography. This needs to be very easy to read and super legible. So for accessible signage, try to use universal design principles to make signs visible and understandable to the widest possible range of people. So other examples of accessible signage would be that lettering surfaces should have a matte or non-glare finish, that tactile lettering should use upper and lowercase letters in a legible sans serif typeface. So this is different throughout the world. I think in the United States that they specify it should be all uppercase, but at least here in Canada it's upper and lowercase. And that character spacing needs to be consistent. So no more than 4 times the stroke width and no less than 3 millimeters. So that brings us to the end of the presentation. Thank you for watching, and as I mentioned, suggested resources are available at rgd.accessibledesign.com. So there are lots of tools and websites and books for further reading on the subject, and I suggest you check them out. Once again, thank you very much for joining us, and that is all.